Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. Happy Easter. I hope you had a fabulous Easter weekend, and I hope you didn't overindulge in the chocolate, or I hope you did, depending on how you feel afterwards. Do tell me if you overindulged. I do love hearing from you, and it's always good for the algorithms if you leave a comment. But I've got a lovely story for you tonight, and if you enjoy a story that's a little bit freaky, this one's going to tick all the boxes for you, I think, and you're really going to enjoy it. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Gwendolyn Taylor loathed her name with an intense passion and could never understand or comprehend why her parents had called her such a loathsome, old-fashioned, antique name that belonged in the history books as far as she was concerned, and was not hip for a 20th century name. Try telling that to her mother, who believed that life in the 18th century was so much more preferable to life in modern-day America, which she believed had become increasingly confused. She gleaned that people muddled through life, wearing blindfolds all the time, and were being forced to be politically correct, lest they should cause offence. People these days are far too oversensitive. Everyone's going around like a tortoise without a shell. You're continually expected to keep your mouth shut, walking on eggshells, lest something you say might upset someone. Society may have gone forwards with technology, but it's gone backwards in every other regard, and chivalry is dying a sad death. Men these days are frightened to even open a car door for a woman, in case she thinks it's patronising and condescending. It's such a dreadful shame. It's tragic. That's what I think it is. Absolutely tragic. In the 1800s, people were so much happier. They knew their intrinsic roles in society. I admit, women should have had more freedom to work back then, if that's what they so wished to do, and should not have been discouraged. But the sexes were celebrated for their individuality, and did not consider themselves inferior to be either a man or a woman. They delighted in their unique differences, appreciating that yin and yang absolutely need each other and are equally as significant. One is not better than the other. They are what they are. The fabric of the universe is both masculine and feminine. If we appreciate this, we'll all get along just fine, without waging war over feelings of inferiority. Gwendolyn's mother had stiff, rigid views about things, and was the most stubborn, obdurate woman you could hope to meet. She loathed every known modern invention with a deep passion, which she viewed with a great deal of sceptical trepidation. "Fools," she would say. "Bloody fools!" She would wave her arms defiantly and shake her mane of dyed red hair furiously. "Wait until artificial intelligence takes over our world. Then we'll simply self-destruct. It'll turn against us, waging war against the human species. If you're human, you'll simply be obliterated. Even the scientists are warning against its potential threat. I'm no expert in these matters, but I can see the writing on the wall if we tread down that dangerous path." Gwendolyn's mother's personality was as fiery as her hair. She loathed politicians from any political persuasion with a passion, believing they were all lower forms of pond life, with only an interest in advancing their own agendas. She would be every political leader's worst nightmare, for she wasn't afraid to challenge them with questions they did not want to answer. "So, Mr. President, can I have a word, please?" she'd cry out on various occasions when she went to political rallies. "Are you going to be raising our taxes? Please will you answer me? I'll have you know, hard-working Americans are tired of being pilferaged for their wages and exploited. You people are robbing us blind and should be totally ashamed of yourselves. All you're interested in is getting rich at our expense. It's disgusting, that's what it is." The political leader in question would hurriedly dive into his car for cover at Gwendolyn's mother's outbursts and scurry away like a frightened mouse, while the crowd would cheer at her brazen confidence and shout out, "Lower taxes! Lower taxes! Lower taxes! Stop robbing us blind! Stop robbing us blind!" Growing up, Gwendolyn's mother did not comprehend her daughter's aversion to her old-fashioned name that had belonged to many an heiress in the 18th century, and its meaning meant fair and blessed. How could anyone be adverse to a name like that? But when you rolled the name on the tongue, it didn't flow with the smoothness of milk chocolate, but stuck in the back of your throat like a prickly pear. The name made Gwendolyn think of an ugly sister in Cinderella, trying to stuff her fat, gnarled, oversized foot, adorned with calluses and unsightly verrucas, into a perfect glass slipper, insisting that her fat foot would fit, because marrying a prince was her only hope in her sorry, sad little life. She was sure that her name belonged to the nondescript woman of the 1800s, whose parents took one look at their ugly baby, lying in the bassinet, and looked despairingly at each other, realizing their kid would never grow up to be a perfect rose. So they both said in unison, "Her name is Gwendolyn." When Gwendolyn was at school, she was bullied for her name, because her parents insisted it could not be shortened to Gwen, under any circumstances, as that would spoil the magnificence of the name. "It's like shortening Victoria to Vicky," her mother had piped. "Victoria is an exquisite name, so noble, so gloriously sophisticated. But Vicky, it's so dreadful, far too tacky for words." According to Gwendolyn's mother, it would be such a travesty to shorten such an aristocratic name. Even the kids perceived Gwendolyn's name was a little off-centre. They would sing out rudely to her on the school playground during break, some sticking their tongue out at her. "Gwendoline needs a dime, 'cause she is far from fine. Gwendoline needs a dime, 'cause she is far from fine." One of the kids even said, "My mummy says you have to be really, really ugly 'cause you've got such an ugly name." Gwendoline's teacher, Mrs. Farrier, who overheard the rude girl's protests, and having seen the cutting remark had hurt Gwendoline greatly, had said to the child, "That's not very nice, Katie. Gwendolyn is a very pretty name for a pretty girl." The girl scrunched up her face in protest. "But it's ugly, Mrs. Farrier. It's an ugly, ugly, ugly name. You can't be princess. You can't be a princess with a name like that. My mummy says you can never be a princess with a name like Gwendolyn." Gwendolyn knew the teacher was just being nice, because her name really sucked, and she'd be a fool to believe otherwise. When Gwendolyn returned home to her mother to tell her how much she loathed her name, her mother told her to stop being so silly. "You have a unique name, Gwendolyn, because you're a unique young girl who will grow up into a beautiful, respectable and classy lady one day. You wouldn't want a common name, would you? That would be so unbecoming." "But Katie's mother said that I had to be really ugly to have such an ugly, ugly name, and that I could never be a princess." "Oh, you're talking about Mrs. Grayson and her daughter Katie. I know the woman well. She's quite frightful. Have you seen the short skirt she wears and the low cleavages on her tops? She leaves nothing to the imagination. She's a walking disgrace, she is. You care about what such a tart thinks of your name? Honestly, Gwendoline, why would you care about her opinion? The woman, dear, does not know the meaning of the word class if it hit her across the face with a baseball bat. Women like her you should always disregard. You can tell a lot about people by the way they dress. If everything is hanging out, you know they've got no shame. So why you care about her opinion, I honestly don't know. But I won't have your name shortened, Gwendoline," she insisted. "It's a very attractive name that I chose especially for you." Her mother could never appreciate how tough it was to be called Gwendoline. Thankfully, when Gwendoline reached her teens, she changed her name to Gwen, against her mother's persuasions, and never looked back. But the memory of being called Gwendoline haunted her. She had strong feelings about parents taking responsibility for the names they called their kids, as some could have lasting damage on a child's psyche, which was why when her 3 children were born, over 25 years ago, she had researched their names thoroughly, calling one of her daughters Sarah because it meant princess, her other daughter Rachel, which means one with purity, and her son Matthew, as it means gift of Yahweh or God. She surmised you could not go wrong with names you found inscripted in the biblical texts, and none of her children had been bullied at school for their names, which made her happy indeed. Gwen was well known in their small rural town in North Carolina by all the locals, and had recently become a much-loved member of the community, where she worked at a local charity shop, selling second-hand goods, which the money was donated to an animal shelter, and Gwen was passionate about the welfare of our furry friends. Gwen worked free of charge at the charity shop, enjoying doing her bit for the greater good, as she believed the more you gave in life, the richer your own personal reward was, and she felt a great deal of satisfaction from the job at the time. She was 56 years old, married to her husband Lucas, and they'd moved to the small town from Albuquerque 2 years ago, after their kids had finally fled the nest. She was afraid of becoming dreadfully lonely after her children left home, but she need not have worried about that, for her life in the small rural town had been very satisfying indeed, and she had made a plethora of good friends for herself. She and her husband had been planning to move to Maine, but on a serendipitous, rather random road trip in their RV, they stumbled quite by chance across the most charming small town in North Carolina, and spontaneously decided to lay down roots there. Gwen described the first time she encountered this town was like that strange feeling of coming home, and the irony her husband felt much the same about the place. The locals, who would normally be adverse to strangers descending upon their midst, like new birds trespassing upon the flock, they had welcomed the couple with open arms, as they felt so at ease with these strangers. By all accounts, the first time that Gwen walked down the high street of that small, rather bewitching town, with its quirky little eccentric shops and classic exterior facades, she knew exactly where the baker's was located and where to find the butcher's shop, and she had no comprehension on how she knew these strange random facts, even when she walked down the beguiling cobbled street, with its old-world charm and its street lamps. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going, as if an old memory was suddenly being reactivated. It would seem her husband was having similar bizarre experiences. Over and over again the locals would repeat, "Why do I get the feeling I've met you before? There's something about the both of you that is rather familiar to me." The words were becoming like a broken record for the delightful couple, and Gwen and her husband could make no sense of it at all. She promptly decided that all this outlandish, unfathomable familiarity was a serendipitous sign sent from heaven itself that they belonged in this prepossessing, charming town. Things were clearly meant to be when they felt right like this, much like a couple committing to each other in marriage, because they knew they belonged together. It was no more different than that. "I think we're like American quarter horses," she explained, "that have arrived to join the rest of the herd, and because we look no different to the rest of them, we fit in. That's why it feels right to move here." Lucas reflected on his wife's words, running his hands over his 2-day-old stubble, which he always did when he was trying to anchor his thoughts. Gwen liked it when he was unshaven, as when he kissed her on the cheek it prickled, which made her giggle like a silly schoolgirl. She considered her husband, even after all these years, to be a feast for the eyes. In her opinion, he was a remarkably handsome man. Frankly, it really didn't matter whether he was wearing a sack over his head or a smart jacket. He always looked great, and was one of those men that definitely improved with age, like a maturing wine. He had thick grey hair that refused to recede, bushy eyebrows that he kept trimmed because they would grow seriously awry, like a burgeoning vine with tentacles all over the place, if they weren't manicured regularly, along with his obtrusive nasal hairs that were equally as robust. Lucas had a square, handsome jawline and steely grey eyes that twinkled with humour, and Gwen loved his eyes, for they reflected a great kindness in their depths. "I don't know," said Lucas, as he was still considering his wife's words. "All I can say is I'm glad we moved here. For me it is like coming home. As to why the place is so familiar to us, honestly I don't know. Who knows? Maybe we visited the town once as young kids, and have no recollection of it. And as for being familiar to the locals, maybe we have a similar physical appearance to a family who lived here once. After all, you and I look a lot alike, don't we? You must admit, Throughout our marriage, people often mistook us for brother and sister, not husband and wife. You know what, Lucas? You're not just a handsome face, but you make some very good discerning points there, she said, wrapping her arms around her husband affectionately and giving him a big hug. She marvelled how she loved him so much more now than she did when they first got married, over 28 years ago. It had been love at first sight when Gwen and her husband, on searching for a property on the outskirts of town, had first laid eyes on Honeysuckle Cottage, which in their eyes was like a cottage you would find written about in a fictional novel. But Honeysuckle Cottage was as real as they come, and looked like it had been birthed from a fairy tale, as even the front yard was littered with exquisite beds of English country flowers that were haphazardly mixed together in an organised chaos that had probably been masterfully designed, but looked like a tangled confetti of poetry in motion, where honeybees and butterflies floated dreamily from delphiniums to daisies and larkspurs, and then framing the small little property that overlooked sprawling meadows and distant groves of trees was the idyllic, perfect white little wicker fence that made the place look delightfully quirky. In Albuquerque, the family had lived in a modern apartment block with sterile fixtures and fittings. It lacked warmth, coziness and charm. If you wanted to escape that characterless, joyless environment, you needed to take a walk in the town, or walk the dog in the park, to escape the drab downness of the concrete monstrosity that they had called home for many long years. The soulless place had been designed by a visionless architect who had no prescient intuition or inspirational imagination whatsoever, and he'd taken minimalism far too seriously. And the architect, with his beige colour palette, thought all details were just needless fluff. Gwen was to realise she liked the fluff very much. She appreciated detail in architectural design. It proved to Gwen in no uncertain terms that office-like buildings did little to indulge our senses, that are always begging to be stimulated. So when you live in a place which is monochromatic, pedestrian and bland, you're going to crave beauty in all its forms, with a yearning of note. But Gwen had found this most certainly to be the case. In those days she was forever escaping the apartment to frolic in a green leafy park, like a free-spirited wild mare. Honeysuckle Cottage had it all, and it more than made up for the dour, dreary monotony of their former apartment in Albuquerque. The couple happily settled down to country life with a zestful enthusiasm, and working at the thrift shop in town had enabled Gwen to meet all kinds of interesting people from all walks of life, and she thoroughly enjoyed every day on her job. It had been an unassuming day in early May, where, although spring was on the precipice of being fully birthed, the cold days of the long austere winter still stained the early evenings and mornings, with the indelible reminder that the coldest months of the year had not been fully defeated yet. The promise of brighter, more sunny days on the horizon had excited Gwen prematurely, especially when the daffodils had burst into colourful bloom in great sweeping carpets of bedazzling, vibrant yellow, complemented by the flowering dogwoods and cherry blossoms, whose previously barren branches, naked from the long drawn-out winter, were now elegantly bedecked with blossoming ethereal blooms. It was easy for Gwen to precipitously conclude that spring had arrived, and she was presumptuously confident and rash in her judgment in this regard, so much so that she had impetuously packed all her winter clothes in a large trunk which she placed in the basement, far too hastily, to make way for her summer clothes. Honeysuckle Cottage did not have much storage space, as her wardrobe was ridiculously small, but she was to find out days later that the weather was so icy cold that she was forced to dig out her puffer jackets from their brief confinement in order to wear them again. Ostensibly she realized with a measure of great regret that winter had not relinquished its fierce hold over North Carolina yet, and was doing so very begrudgingly, so you could deceptively feel, based on just one good day, that the weather had finally surrendered to the vibrant cause of spring. But you would be very wrong in your assumptions there. On this particular morning in May, the day had looked inviting from the very start, so much so that Gwen was very tempted to wear a pretty sundress, but she knew from bitter experience it was better to be safe rather than sorry, so she wisely opted to wear layers of clothing over her jeans, which was a decision she would not regret later that morning. The sky was a beautiful cup of blue, and the fragrant early morning sun dappled the cottage in pretty shadows of dancing light. By the time Gwen reached the out-of-the-closet thrift store in town, the sky had significantly darkened, and grey clouds seemed to float menacingly across the firmament, wiping the smiles off people's faces with its grim sense of foreboding, as the small town was basking under this dimming light. In a trice the heavens opened like a tsunami, and it began to pour with rain. Gwen was glad to get into the shop in time, to avoid the deluge, as it began to bucket down without apology, and it looked like the forlorn withering tears of the sky were here to stay indefinitely. For many people they were completely caught off guard by these fortuitous showers that no one saw coming, that even the so-called savvy weather forecasters had failed to predict. But Gwen had learnt over the years that these forecasters could get their weather divinations horribly wrong, and so she'd never relied on their narratives. Otherwise, more often than not, she'd have left the house without an umbrella, and Gwen hated being caught in the rain. "Phew! Look at the weather, Gladys! It's raining cats and dogs out there! I'm glad I'm not caught out in that rain. I got here in the nick of time," said Gwen, looking out of the shop window onto the pavement, the parking bay, and the street beyond, fringed by large sculptural oak trees. She began to skillfully arrange the dog-eared selection of books that someone had generously donated, that looked suspiciously as if some of the pages had been nibbled by an infestation of ambitious mice who had acquired a select taste for printed paper. Gwen arranged all the books in alphabetical order on one of the shelves, with the efficiency of a skilled librarian. "Well, I'm glad I brought an umbrella with me today," said Gladys. "You can never trust those weather forecasters. They get it horribly wrong all the time." The two women began to bustle around the shop, busying themselves with serving customers who came passing through, like ships docking at different locations. Soon the sun began to filter through the rain clouds, and a pretty rainbow appeared in the sky, as the dark clouds just melted away, so that the thrift shop became a great deal busier, as the bell above the door seemed to jangle all day long, and it seemed like Gwen had been run off her feet most of the day. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Gwen heard the quiet female voice. "Do you accept clothes from dead people?" Gwen looked up from behind the counter to observe a skinny, nervous-looking young woman with long, dark brown hair, peering at her short-sightedly. The girl had one brown eye and one green eye, but they were hard to see clearly, as the girl seemed to take refuge behind the sweeping curtains of her hair, where she could clandestinely hide herself from any intrusive stares, which was silly really, because the girl had not got anything to be self-conscious about. She was strikingly pretty, if she'd get all that hair out of her face, that was. She was obviously desperately shy, but if Gwen had her way she'd pull the young girl's hair away from her face to see her clearly. But the girl, as she spoke, refused to maintain eye contact with Gwen. "Sorry, what did you say? I didn't hear you." "Do you accept clothes from dead people?" She was wearing black jeans, a black sweater and boots, and seemed like a fish out of water in the shop, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the entire world rather than this thrift shop, and Gwen suspected it had not been easy for her to come into the shop for some reason. Her long, thin white fingers were quivering as she held out a half-full black bin liner and stretched her hand towards Gwen, expecting her to take it from her. "My uncle died. He liked animals a lot. I thought he'd be happy if I donated his stuff for him to an animal charity." As the girl spoke, Gwen felt a shiver of dread prickling down the back of her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up on end. Without any definitive explanation, Gwen felt her heart pounding violently in her chest, and she had the overwhelming sense that the contents in the girl's black bin liner she certainly did not want to receive, almost as if she perceived something was terribly wrong. But Gwen told herself very stiffly to stop being so ridiculous. This kind girl was donating her uncle's old clothes. The least she could do was sound appreciative and grateful. For indeed, without the generosity of random strangers, Out of the closet would not even exist, and she wouldn't even have her job. She'd do well to remember that. "Of course we accept clothes from dead people," said Gwen, offering the girl a watery smile, as she politely viewed the ominous black bin liner the young girl was handing over to her, with a degree of trepidation. It would be impolite to refuse anything donated to the store, but she could smell the manky contents of the bin liner from a mile away, and privately suspected she was being delivered a pile of dirty, very smelly laundry, and the thought made her shudder with disgust. Did people not comprehend that a thrift shop did not enjoy receiving soiled smalls and socks that smelt of cottage cheese? She had seen some bad things in her time. On one occasion she'd received a man's dirty adult diapers amongst his underpants and vests, and she had taken the contents politely from the person who was donating the stuff, wondering how anyone in their right mind could deliver anything quite so revolting. It had smelt as rank as a cat's filthy litter tray. Some people had no shame, it would seem. Did they really expect her to separate the soiled diapers from the underpants and put them on sale in the thrift shop? Did people not mind wearing other people's cast-off undies? And there was no way even a piping hot wash could wash away the indelible memory of that god-awful smell. On another occasion she'd received an old woman's dentures, a pair of buckled reading glasses, and a collection of old teeth. And then there was the occasion an old woman had donated a taxidermist selection of rats that her husband had owned while he was alive, believing that someone else would fully appreciate owning the collection. Her friend had lined up the rats all over the front desk, and the moment that Gwen had seen them, she had physically screamed. She thought the place had suddenly been infested with rogue rats, until her friend assured her they were not real, but they were stuffed. "I just think I need to tell you something," said the girl hesitantly. "There are some of my uncle's clothes in the bin liner, but I've also included a very special pipe. It's a collector's item, you know." "Sounds intriguing," said Gwen. "We very much appreciate collector's items around here. I'm sure it will be in great demand." "It is a collector's item," said the young girl, lowering her voice so that no one else in the thrift store could hear. "My uncle, he worked in a prison, you know. He was one of the prison guards there. One of the men on death row gave my uncle the pipe. He wasn't allowed to keep it, you see, and he wanted his pipe to go to a good home, and he always liked my uncle. My uncle tried to refuse the pipe, but the convicted murderer told him he should never refuse a gift when it's given to you. So my uncle accepted the pipe. But after the pipe came into his possession, he was never the same again, you know. He suffered from dreadful insomnia and nightmares, you see. He thought it might be connected to the pipe he'd given, so he locked it away in a glass cabinet. It might be a coincidence, of course. You see, my uncle didn't judge people, no matter what they'd done in their lives, even if it was really, really bad. And this man, he was bad, and I mean bad. He killed over 15 young women, you know, but for some reason he liked my uncle. You don't want to get on the bad side of a very bad man like that, because that man killed 2 prison guards, but he always respected my uncle." Gwen raised her eyebrows. "Are you being serious? Your uncle knew a man who killed 15 women and 2 prison guards, and he owns the pipe that you're giving to me?" "Bloody hell! I don't know what to say to that." The girl appeared to enjoy Gwen's startled reaction. "I asked my uncle who the killer's name was, but he refused to tell me those details. But the killer did like him a lot, and asked him to keep the pipe safely. I thought I should let you know the history, because the man was executed by lethal injection. His last words to my uncle were, 'Tell them I'll be back. Tell them I'll be back, and I'll get them.' It naturally creeped my uncle out, which is why he locked the pipe up for all time's sake in a glass cabinet. But when he removed the pipe to show a friend the other day, to tell him the story connected to the pipe, as his friend was fascinated, he was found the following morning, completely dead, with strange bruise marks around his neck that looked like finger marks. The coroner said he died of suffocation, as if someone had strangled him to death, but my uncle had no known enemies. I removed the pipe this morning from the glass cabinet. It gave me the chills. I thought I should warn you, in case... In case what? Asked Gwen, raising a quizzical brow. Gwen was many things, but superstitious was not one of those things. She was prudently practical, and had no problem with receiving an old pipe that had belonged to a serial killer. So what if it had belonged to some unsavoury character in the past? It was just an obsolete material item that someone might like to own. Some pipes could be quite collectible these days, but people could be so superstitious at times. Still, it was a first to be receiving a pipe belonging to a serial killer, and if she was to sell it in the thrift store, she'd have to warn people of its unsavoury history. "Well, in case people are superstitious," said the young girl. "I know I am," she said uncertainly. "I'm living in my uncle's place with my mother, you see. We don't want it anywhere near us. It's a beautiful-looking pipe, but there's a message on the side of the pipe in Hungarian which reads, Ordok lovodul valvel nekem. It means the devil rides with me." Gwen shrugged her shoulders. "Well, you know, when people buy things from a thrift shop, they don't know where it comes from, who it belongs to, and frankly they don't really care. If it's a nice collector's piece, as you say, I'm sure the pipe will bring someone great pleasure. Of course it would be irresponsible of me if I didn't tell them what the writing on the side means, and that the pipe belonged to an evil man responsible for 15 heinous killings, but it is only a pipe." "That's my worry," said the girl. "Is it just a pipe? The Hungarians made the most bent pipes in the world. It's a beautiful piece of workmanship, I agree. It's comfortable in the mouth because it can be held in the mouth for a long period of time without becoming too heavy on the jaws. It's known as an Paul pipe, and it has a big tobacco chamber. But my uncle never used the pipe. He said it was a magnificent piece of workmanship and could be of great value one day." "Well, I'm sure someone will be glad to have it," said Gwen, almost choking on her words, holding the bag rather reluctantly in her hands with a vacillating hesitancy, knowing that the contents were incredibly unappealing to say the least. But nothing surprised her in the thrift store. The things people brought into the shop never ceased to amaze her, but a pipe from someone who had murdered 15 women and 2 prison guards, who had been on death row and executed by lethal injection, was an all-time first, and she wondered how Gladys would react when she told her the sobering news about who had owned the pipe. She watched the girl with the skinny legs and the long dark hair, walking out of the shop with a more confident swing to her step than when she'd first entered the place. She was obviously heartily relieved to have offloaded the pipe onto Gwen. She and her mother were eager to relinquish it from their home. She turned around briefly and gave Gwen a shy smile, and then she said to her, as she was leaving the shop, Please will you take care?" There was an earnestness in her voice that gave Gwen the chills, and then she promptly sauntered away. Gwen was still staring after the young girl in bemusement, as if she'd just had a bucket of cold water thrown over her head. She was trying to rewind the strange events of the last few minutes in her head, asking herself if it had been real. She trembled as she retreated into the back room of the shop, while Gladys gave her a warm nod, looking approvingly at the black bin bag in Gwen's hands. "Another donation! Oh, how lovely! What a sweet girl! Never seen her before a day in my life. Who is she?" "I'd be damned if I know," said Gwen gingerly. "I better go and sort this stuff out." "Well, go along, will you, Gwen? But don't be too long, because I'm going to need you out here. The rain has gone, the black clouds have retreated, and it's a sunny day. And when it's like this, we are so busy. So I will be short-handed if you don't help me. So be quick, will you? Don't you worry, I will be." Gwen grimaced to herself. She was sure that whatever was in the black bin liner was far from lovely, but she'd soon face the music of what the bag actually contained, and was pretty certain it would not be favourable. The pongy smell of dirty clothes was already tempting her to go to the back of the shop and dispose of the whole thing in the garbage dump, but that would be a very mean thing to do. It had been a strange afternoon. Gwen carried the bin liner to the back of the shop, tagging on a pair of blue gloves for hygiene reasons. She emptied out the contents of the black bin liner onto the sorting table, the words echoing in her head with an airy resonance. "Please, you will take care." Once the stinking contents of the black bin liner had spilled onto the table, Gwen let out a loud, discomposing scream. So there we are. That's the end of part 1 in our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it gets very exciting, so I don't want you to miss out, because I'm really enjoying this story, and I hope you are too. So until next time, goodbye and good night.